Hello, hello. How is everyone? Well, it's Friday and we survived yet another week. So excited to welcome you to the New England Mystery Writers Roundtable with Julia Spencer-Fleming, Archer Mayer, and Paula Munier, plus Sarah Stewart Taylor, who will be moderating. So fun for us. Julia and Archer and Sarah are old friends of the festival. They did a panel together back in 2003, and we love them dearly. Paula is new, but we're already huge fans. One of her characters is a bomb-sniffing dog named Elvis. Plus, she makes me want to redecorate my house. You'll see that. Staying in the summer mode tonight, I'm going with a Von Trapp lager, or an ale rather, and what is everyone else drinking?
Gin and tonic.
Lukewarm Aperol Spritz.
Do we have a survey for everybody?
Yeah.
I can't vote. Sarah, I don't see lukewarm Aperol Spritz on the possibilities.
I don't recommend it. It really needed the ice. So I wouldn't vote for it even if it was.
Paula, what do you have?
Molotov cocktail.
Yeah.
I have kind of a Long Island iced tea, sort of faked by whatever was still left in the bar cart after my children came and went. They're adults, but still.
So tonight, if you want to ask the author a question, use the question and answer button on your screen. Sarah will then ask the questions for you. And you can vote for your favorite question using the thumbs up icon. Popular questions will move to the top of the queue. Sarah Stewart Taylor is the author of the Sweeney St. George series and the Maggie D'Arcy series of mysteries. She grew up on Long Island and was educated at Middlebury College in Vermont and Trinity College in Dublin, where she studied Irish literature. She has worked as a journalist and a writing teacher, and now she lives with her family on a farm in Vermont where they raise sheep. And she also serves on the school board.
That's true.
So take it away, Sarah.
All right. Thank you so much, Sandy. And thank you to Sandy and Jerry for organizing this. This is really, it's really fun for me to get to interview some of my favorite mystery authors who I'm lucky to call friends as well. So we all, as you know, live in northern New England. Archer is from right here in Vermont. Julia is a Maine author, and Paula lives in New Hampshire. So we, as we were sort of talking about all of our books, and we started talking about setting in our books a lot, and we decided that we wanted to sort of form a little group and call ourselves the Stone Cold Crime Writers. And you may see us doing some events and doing some more of these Zoom author chats around New England and perhaps even farther afield. But it's been really fun to talk about sort of how we all use setting in our work. And I know that's something that we're going to be talking about a lot tonight. But I want to start by just giving you some brief introductions to these wonderful writers and their work. And then I have some questions for them, and I have some questions that have already been submitted by you all, and I'm sure we'll have some more as we go. So I'm going to start out with Archer. Vermont's own Archer Mayer, of course, writes the Joe Gunter series of crime novels. There are 31 Joe Gunter novels, which I think is just amazing and awe-inspiring, and they're all great. Joe is a detective with the Vermont Bureau of Investigation right here in Vermont, and Joe and his team investigate murders in Vermont, but also sometimes farther afield. Sometimes Archer allows them to go outside the state borders and do some detecting other places as well. one of the things that I love about Archer's work is the way that he explores all facets of life in Vermont. He doesn't just give us the sort of postcard version of life in Vermont, and his books are really wonderful. He lives with his wife, Margot, and one cat, or do you have more than one cat? One cat named Gilbert, right?
Indeed.
Gilbert. And they live in Newfane. So we're really excited to have Archer here. And Archer has a new book coming out in September called The Orphan's Guilt. So put that on your calendar. So you, or even better, pre-order it. So you don't even have to put it on your calendar. Pre-order it and it'll just come to you. Next, we have Julia Spencer-Fleming. Julia is the author of 9 books in the wonderful Clare, Ferguson, and Russ Van Alstyne mystery series. And did I say Van Alstyne?
You know, Van Alstyne or Van Alstyne. I say Van Alstyne, but
Okay.
people in upstate New York pronounce it in different ways.
So however you want to pronounce it. But Russ and Clare do their detecting in a town in the Adirondacks. So Julia, though she lives in Maine, writes all about these just gorgeous mountains that I'm sure many of you have visited, but also the towns that are sort of in and amongst those mountains. And she gets into issues of environmental activism and logging and the opiate crisis. And she really, like Archer, I think her books really, give a complete view of life in those beautiful, beautiful communities. I love her books. And Julia lives in an old farmhouse outside of Portland, Maine, with, I think, a number of adult children who have come home to you, right?
I've got an expanded quarantine family now. Yes, so I now have 3 adult children living with me, and I have expanded I was down to 1 cat. Now I'm back up to 2 cats plus a dog, some of whom you may see tonight.
Excellent. I hope we do. And then last but not least, we have Paula Munier. I think I got that, Munier. And Paula is a New Hampshire writer, but her series is set in southeastern Vermont, and she writes beautifully, I think, about that the particular sort of qualities of those mountains and those forests. Her series is, she's written 2 books in the Mercy Carr series, Mercy Carr and Elvis. I can't forget Elvis because he's a very, very important part of the series. And she has a 3rd one coming out next year, which is very exciting. Mercy Carr is a former military police officer, and Elvis is a retired bomb-sniffing dog. And they have, after some trauma, have returned to Vermont, where Mercy meets up with a game warden who she has a working relationship with, and perhaps something more. We'll see. And Paula lives in New Hampshire with quite a few dogs. You'll have to tell us exactly how many. I know there are quite a few.
Yes, there are quite a few dogs. I was just at the vet and with one of the dogs, and she said, well, I have 7 dogs because we just rescued another dog. So we have 2 dogs, 2 rescues. One's a Newfoundland Retriever mix, and the other is an Australian cattle dog, Great Pyrenees mix, big dogs. And we just rescued last week an adorable Malinois mix who's much like Elvis in the book. And we just couldn't be happier with her. Her name is Blondie. So now we have 3 rescue dogs and a rescue cat who disdains them all. Yeah. And we live in a multi-generational household, and it's lots of fun, multi-generations of people and dogs.
And dogs. Excellent. Sounds good. And Paula has a paperback coming out very soon, right?
Right, September, so yay.
September, excellent. So the paperback of her 2nd book is coming out then. It's called Blind Search. And Julia's 9th book, Hid from Our Eyes, was just out this spring. So you can get that wherever books are sold. So I thought I would start out by having you each just give a brief description of your newest book, And then tell us, what was your favorite thing about writing that book? I always find that, each of my books there's sort of something about it that it's just, my favorite part of writing that book, whether it's research or it's a new character I've introduced. And I'm curious about your favorite part of your newest books. So Archer, why don't you start, then Julia, and then Paula.
Well, okay, thank you. Bomber's Moon, and this is not to be pompous, but I think that's the title we're talking about. Is that correct? I lose
Yes,
track.
although we'd love to hear about the Orphan's Guild. It's up to you,
yeah,
which you want to talk about.
Yeah, I always like to talk about things that people can't read because they're not out yet. No, so Bomber's Moon, I lose track. Bomber's Moon is named basically that because on a bomber's moon in World War II, you could see exactly where to drop your bombs, but of course there's a double message in that the people trying to shoot you down could see you quite well also. So it's a beware what you wish for missive, which brings me to my favorite part, which is a crook. A young crook. He's inventive, he's terribly bright, he loves a challenge, and where most of us would just grab a purse and run, he finds that dreadfully dull and therefore conjures up some of the most complicated ways to grab a purse, and then attach a bunch of beneficial to him side products to that, or side motions. And this guy is clearly far brighter than he needs to be. And you sort of know fatalistically that sooner or later he's going to get into trouble. So there's a sort of a tragi-comic aspect to this poor guy. And in many ways he's based, not fundamentally, but he is influenced, I should say, by someone I met back in the days when I worked as a plainclothes detective. I was looking for some evidence, testimonial in nature, and a fellow cop got hold of me and said, "Well, you got to talk to this guy. He knows what you need to know, and then you can go on down the line and crack this thing open." And then he looked at me sort of funny, and he said, "But be careful." And I thought, "Oh God, here we go. The guy's 250 pounds and 6'6". And he went, "You're going to want your daughter to marry him." And I did. I mean, a more charming, super smart, seductive human being you've rarely met. I mean, he was just a terrific guy. Of course, when we met, he was in prison, and I knew he was going to return there after he got out, and he's just kept going down that very sad and predictable path. So I write books about people as much as place, and I would say that Bomber's Moon, which takes place all over Vermont, still my favorite crux of it was this young gentleman.
Great. I love that. Julia.
Agreed. He's a great character. Let's see, my favorite part. Okay, so my last book was Hid from Our Eyes, came out this spring. I was going to be flip and say my favorite part was finishing it because it was many years in the offing. But I think that's probably true for almost all of us. The absolute best part is when you've absolutely finished it. No, Archie, you put the rest of us to shame.
No, I get depressed.
It's sort of like exercising. It's like the best part is when you've done and you're done for the day. So the book is about 3 generations of police chiefs in this small Adirondack town. One in 1952, one in 1972, and one in the present day, which in the book is 2006. So, and the book opens with each police department discovers a young woman in a fancy dress, no shoes, no handbag, no stockings, no nothing, dead on a country road, in almost the same spot, decades apart, with no obvious signs of how she died. And in fact, in 1952 and 1972, They are unable to, the medical examiners cannot figure out how she died. So it's a generational thing. And probably my favorite part of writing it was getting to explore one of my main protagonists, Russ Van Alstyne, is in the series. He's a mature man. We meet him when he's like 48. He's in his early 50s now. And so he's very been there and done that. And he's very grown up. But we get to go back and see throughout a lot of this book what he was like in 1972 as this very angry, screwed up 20-year-old who was just back from Vietnam and doesn't know what he's doing and can't manage his life. And I really like looking at a completely different aspect of what feels like a really well-known character. So it taught me a lot about him, and hopefully the readers are enjoying it as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Paula, what about you?
Okay, so I had muted myself because the dogs were kind of going crazy here. So sorry about that. What I love about writing the books is the dogs. What I liked about writing Blind Search is that it was inspired by a true story of a little boy who was lost in the woods in Vermont and was saved by a search and rescue team, including canines. And this little boy had autism. And I found out in my research that the people most likely to get lost in the woods are not necessarily hikers and hunters. They're kids with autism and elderly people with dementia, because they wander off and they hide. They don't come out when you call for them. And that's why the dogs are so good, because the dogs find them through scent. They don't find them through calling. So I loved writing that story. I loved writing that little boy. I raised 2 boys myself and friends and family on the spectrum. So it was fun to write that little boy. He was a lovely little boy named Henry. And then, of course, the dogs are fun. I love the dogs. I have Elvis, who's the former bomb-sniffing dog, a Malinois. And then we have Susie Bear, who's a search and rescue dog. And they're all based on dogs I've met, right, or own, have it here at home. And we just got a Malinois puppy too. So I also got to write about service dogs in this one, specifically service dogs who help children with autism. So all that's great fun.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful. We got a couple of questions actually about process. And I always love hearing about other writers' process, because I think it's so specific to the writer. We all have such different ways of turning ideas into full-length novels. And so I'm gonna ask you sort of a 2-part question. And the first part is where do your ideas come from? Where do you get sort of the initial concept for the next book in your series? And then the second part of the question is, what's your process? How do you approach it? Are you a pantser? Are you a plotter? Do you like outlines? Do you like rough drafts? How do you make the magic? So Archer, we'll start with you.
My inspiration are the twin engines of ignorance and curiosity. I like to write about what I don't know about, and I like to write about what I can find out more about by picking other people's brains who are far smarter than I. And so each book is stimulated by an eagerness to tunnel into a variety of subjects. I write relatively complicated books, but I also want to be able to translate my findings into something intriguing and streamlined for my readers, so that they can enjoy finding out new stuff, but at the same time have an entertaining ride. And so it's an organic process, which is then subsequently, to answer your second question, mirrored in my process. My process is based on this ignorance and based on these questions and based on my pursuit of answers. I begin to interview people and to travel places and to poke my nose where I'm not invited. And I begin to research and purposefully over-research so that I've got enough for, let's say, an 800-page book when I'll probably end up with a 300-pager. After I have done months and months of this and just let it percolate around and get influenced like by people such as the young man I referenced, I then, to mimic Dashiell Hammett, I put my ass in a chair and begin to write. And I literally start with the first page and I just keep on going. And 300 pages later, I've got a book. I don't outline, I don't plot, I don't write notes, I don't, nothing. I'm an air traffic controller in a windowless and radar-less room. And obviously, the final product is the result of a massive amount of editing. So I personally and others whose opinion I trust, this doesn't involve the publisher one bit. I keep the publisher in the dark until the very last moment. I want the publisher to say, nice book, here's the check. That's all I want from them. My editors are the ones that I line up. And so I may edit this stream of consciousness up to 20 different times before I submit it to the publisher. That's my process.
Yeah, where I started sort of laughing in a self-conscious way as Archer was giving that answer, because my process is so much messier than that. And I saw some other smiles and and funny expressions. So Julia, how do you feel when you hear Archer say that?
Inadequate. No, actually, what I want to know is, how does that, because you are, one of the things you're really known for is you are a genuine book a year, which I thought was always October, but maybe it's September now. But,
September, yeah.
But you know, it's like every year, like clockwork, you've got the new hardcover out. So are you researching while you're working on the other book, or do you just have a much shorter drafting period for the first draft?
Well, I'm not sure that I know, Julia. It's not that rigid. In a funny kind of way, it takes me 14 months to write a book every year. So, I was never a math major. So there is an overlap. And I suppose the overlap is January, February, March, where I'm sort of doing three things at once. I'm editing a book, I'm writing a book, and I'm creating a book in my brain by starting to do the initial interviews. And so it's a bad time to ask me how the book is coming along, because I have no idea how to answer that. So
I feel there's never a good time to ask how the book is coming along. Not a question I ever want to hear. Okay, so let's see. So my process, ideas. Most of the kernels of my plots, at least, or things that happen to the characters, often come from a real life something. It'll be something that I've read, a newspaper story. Hid from Our Eyes was really, I think, one of the only books where the initiating concept didn't come from a crime or sort of story that tweaked me, but actually the experience when I was noodling the idea. Because what happens to me is, as I'm working on one book, about within halfway through usually, I'm starting to sort of see what's going to happen to the characters and what's going to go on next. And so I start noodling about the next book after that. But I was noodling Hid from Our Eyes when my son was finishing up high school. And one of the things that I really observed with him, and he had this great group of friends, but I never had actually observed close up teenage boys until I grew one of my own. I have a younger brother, but he's 9 years younger than I am. So I was married by the time he was in those years. And one of the things that really fascinated me, and Paula, you may have seen this too, because you've got sons, is that boys need models to learn how to become men. They tend to really, young men, they're looking for older men, older role models to tell them how to, how to become men, how to grow up. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a good man? And they can latch onto these mentors and role models for good or for ill. And I was observing this and thinking a lot about it. And that gave me the kernel of the most recent book, because what it's really about, it's the murder that takes place in 3 years, but what it's really about are 3 generations of young men who were then looking to an older man to sort of be their mentor and teacher and to guide them. And there's sort of a dark aspect of that as well going on with the book. For my writing process, I'm laughing because for those of you in the audience who don't know, it was 6 years between my last book and It From Our Eyes. So my writing process consisted at that point of a lot of not writing. Ideally, what I do is I will, once I've conceived the idea, like Archer, I will do research, not nearly as much as he does. What I started out doing more research, and I found I used to get caught up in the research so much that I didn't stop it and start writing. So what I try and do is kind of the minimum to get me on the road. And then as I'm writing, I throw up a lot of questions. What is this? What is that? I'll leave chunks in the writing where I need to talk to somebody or confirm facts or get things straightened out. So I continue to research as I write along. I am a slow writer, even when it doesn't take me years and years. I don't do a really slapdash first draft. I kind of wish I could, but I don't mentally seem to be able to get there. So I write a pretty meticulous first draft that usually does not need a whole lot of editing. Also, like Archer, I have had some friends who are my first readers. And they will read it before it goes to my editor and give me, advice if they don't understand things, if something seems missing, which I find enormously helpful as part of the process.
Great. What about you, Paula?
Well, I got my idea for the series when I did this fundraiser for Mission Canine Rescue, which is an organization that rescues military working dogs who have been found in kill shelters or abandoned in some way. The Army does a pretty good job of taking care of Army dogs, but a lot of the dogs who serve our country are defense contractor dogs, and so their futures can be very uncertain. And that's what Mission Canine Rescue does, is find these dogs, bring them home, find them forever homes. So I met at this fundraiser, I met all kinds of handlers and their dogs. So I met, soldiers and their bomb-sniffing dogs. I met game wardens and their dogs. I met, law enforcement and their drug-sniffing dogs. I met all these dogs, and I sort of fell in love with the dogs. And then I thought, well, it would be fun to write a story about. Yeah. And I grew up as an Army brat, so I have, enormous sort of affection for military. And I always thought, had I been born later in life, there would have been pressure on me, as there was pressure on my male counterparts at my age to go into, to pick an academy and go. And I didn't, because I was born too early, and just as well. But I always thought, what if? So I like the idea of writing a female, military policewoman. And I love the idea. Usually what I do is I get this image in my head of an opening scene. And for A Borrowing of Bones, it was this image of Mercy home from the war with the bomb-sniffing dog she's inherited that she promised she would take care of, because her fiance has died in the same battle that wounded her, and he said, take care of my dog. And together she and the dog, Elvis, are marching through the Vermont wilderness. They're marching off their grief. I had this image in my head, and I sort of went from there. I did write a book called Plot Perfect about how to plot a novel. So I tend to follow my own advice, my own process, where I use a bunch of index cards, and I know that first draft is at least 60 scenes. So I write ideas for scenes on 60 cards, and then I sort of order them, and I kind of go from there and finesse as I go. In the case of Blind Search, I had come across this article about this little boy who was lost in the woods, and that was the impetus for that. And then for this latest book, it was, which will be out next year, The Hiding Place, it was a suggestion from my editor who said, oh, you know, because her grandfather was a sheriff. He goes, let's do a cold case book. So that was a whole different slew of problems. I had never written a cold case story before, and that required some finagling on my part. So.
Wonderful. Oh, I love hearing about all the different ways people approach this. One of the things about writing a mystery series, I guess if you're lucky and you get to keep writing them, is that you have these characters who have become almost like members of your family because you've spent so much time thinking about them, and you get to depict them over time. You know, you get to show them aging, you get to show them going in and out of relationships, you get to show them responding to current events. And I'm curious how you all approach that characterization, how you let your characters grow and evolve and change, while retaining the things that your readers love about them. Archer, why don't you start?
Well, I'm on the horns of a dilemma there because my folks don't age. And I think this was just misbegotten ambition on my part. I began this series of books, 130 years ago, and so reasonably I placed it approximate to that time zone, and yet here we are all these years later. So I can't refer to the fact that he was a combatant in the War of 1812 because that just sounds awkward. But early readers go, oh, hang on, he predates electricity. So this is, so I've stopped referring to his misbegotten antiquarian youth, and yet I do like to show relationships. I do like to show the entanglements and evolutions of all these characters. And I have a fairly large group who keep me company. And in fact, if anything, it's grown over time and it's multi-generational. So it's sort of an interesting tangle because I've got all the research and the hardware. I've got all the people like the young man I referenced who are not regular characters, and then I have the regular characters. So how do you do all of this in 300 pages without making it such a clotted mess that the reader simply cannot enter? And the only rule I've ever applied to all of that is, as a writer, never forget you're a reader first, and always approach your writing as if you were reading it. And if you don't like something as a reader, now's your opportunity to change it because you actually can. As readers, we just close the book and throw it across the room. But as a writer / reader, then you hold yourself responsible. So it's a mishmash, and I'm afraid I can't really supply a clear answer to a wonderful, complicated question.
It's so interesting to me because as soon as you said that, I thought, oh, of course, that's right. And yet I think of Joe over the series, and he absolutely has evolved and had different relationships, and each of those has acted itself upon him in a different way. But that's right. He chronologically, Joe.
Yeah. A reader was quite helpful to me by stating that she doesn't see them as year-separated books. She sees each book as having occurred a few months subsequent to its predecessor.
Yeah. Oh, that was
very helpful. Yeah, it's still a stretch, but it was her way of dealing with that. Otherwise, a bit of a dichotomy, and I was grateful for that insight.
What about you, Julia?
Well, so I was thinking, actually, Archer and I had a conversation about this at Toadstool Bookstore, I think it was in Milford, and I was saying that I found Joe very hot, you know? And then we sort of got talking, and then it turned out like if we followed real life, Joe was my dad's age, and it was like So, and actually, I remember in that conversation, one of the things that you had said, Archer, was that you had gotten to the point where you were sort of eluding a lot of those clues. You didn't have to reference his actual age or reference, you know, his earlier service in the War of 1812. And I've taken a note from that because I am also reaching a point when I started writing what was my first novel, In the Bleak Midwinter, in like 1998 or 99. I finished it in 2000, so it's plausibly set in the year 2000. And you know, and then I turned it in. It got published in 2002. Well, it's now 18 years later, but literally only 6 years at the most has passed in Miller's Kill. So I'm working on the 10th book now, and I'm doing the same sort of thing. I'm kind of just skimming over some of those markers. I think that a lot of my characters, they are aging because they also have children who are aging, but I'm going to sort of keep it a little bit vague. Somebody who I think does a really good job with this is Deborah Crombie, who writes a wonderful series, her Duncan Kincaid and Gemma James series. And they also have these real, I mean, they've got families, they each have a family, they wind up creating a family together, they've got, you know, friends. And she's been, I think her first book came out in the late 90s. But her characters are not, you know, they're not hitting retirement age. People grow, they develop, they change because of their experiences in past books. But they're just sort of skipping over time a little bit, and keeping it going.
Great, thank you. Paula, what about you? You haven't had quite as long to have to grapple with these. Your character is very youthful still.
No, but I thought about this early on, because I read a lot of series. I love Archer's series, and I love Julia Spencer-Fleming's series. As I've done, like, you know, quite crazy fan of Deborah Crombie and Louise Penny and all these people who write series, and I love series. And so what I thought about, okay, so how am I going to do this? So I decided that because Vermont is so, which is where the books are set, and New England in general, the seasons are so spectacular. One of the reasons I love living here is because the seasons are so distinct. So I just moved the book up a season. You know, each book is a new season, and that gives me a chance to explore, especially the transition between seasons, not just in nature, but in people's lives. So when Mercy first comes home, she's doing that transition from civilian to military life. She's doing that transition from grief to acceptance, you know, all these transitions. So that sort of, over the first 3 books, you see her journey, trying to fit into the civilian world, trying to make a new life for herself, trying to get past her grief and finally accept it and move on for her fallen fiance, trying to develop a relationship with Elvis, who is a one-man dog, and his dog has died in Afghanistan, and his man has died in Afghanistan, and now, you know, he's her dog, and how is she going to create this bond with him? So I'm really interested in those transitions in people's lives, and I think each book sort of marks that transition both in nature and in their lives.
I love that. That's great. What about setting? We've touched a little bit on setting, and I think for all 3 of you, setting is, you know, I think it drives character, it drives plot, it drives the structure. It sounds like for Paula, you know, the way the series is structured is related to the specific way that the seasons are experienced in this specific part of the world. And talk a little bit about how you approach setting, writing about settings you know well, and writing about settings you don't know as well. How do you do that, Archer?
Well, of course, primarily my guy comes out of Vermont, and even if he does travel, he does so, he doesn't go to Bangkok. So it's not a huge stretch in terms of weather and climate and whatnot. He is occasionally a stranger in a strange land. I've had him go to Chicago. I've had him go to Montreal, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C. So he does wander about, and the urban environment will influence him in a variety of complicated ways. I have him now in the book I'm writing in Rhode Island. These are all those places that I know very little about or never been to before, and I go and visit them. So it's my impressions that I impose upon him as I begin to write that series. So it's interesting to me to just sort of become Joe experientially, so that I just need to repeat for my reader what I experienced personally. That having been said, I've lived in Vermont for 40 years, and that's 40 winters and 40 summers and 40 everything else. That's 40 years of inhabiting an environment that wants to kill you approximately, 7 months out of the year. That, if it ain't character forming, you have no character. So now I have lived in a vast number of places before I settled in Vermont. And in many of those places, the environment is not out to kill you, at least not in the same way. I found that excruciatingly boring. And I therefore use the environment, the weather, in my case, the mountains and the woods and the facility to engage with Mother Nature versus the urban canyons to form my character's personality.
Yep, great.
They become the place, and it becomes character, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And as you say, it shapes your characters. I think that's the thing that I'm so interested in, is how the setting shapes the characters. And in many cases, I think sort of drives them to make choices that drive the plot. And they may be choices that you wouldn't make if you lived somewhere else. I find that really interesting. What about you, Julia?
I was just thinking when Archer was saying that, and I bet all of us know, one thing I noticed living in Maine is, and you see the same thing up where I write about in, the northeastern part of New York State, is there are these incredibly tough old birds. They're like these old guys and these old ladies. They're like 90 years old, and they're still going out and they're slowly shoveling the driveway. And I know a woman who volunteers at our little local library who is definitely pushing 90 now. And finally, like when she was about 85 or 86, she stopped like bringing her wood in from just a giant pile left by the wood guy, and she let her sons-in-law like bring it into the garage. So she only had to bring the wood for her wood stove in from the garage. But and she was kind of bummed about that, but she made it to like 86 before that happened. So it's a hard climate, and it breeds tough people, and if people who can't hack it leave, they go down to, I don't know, Florida or something, where they have their own kind of tough climate. So I have said many, many times, it's a popular refrain of mine, that I think that mystery, crime fiction, but really mystery specifically, deals with location better than almost any other form of fiction that I see coming out nowadays. So much of what you read, if you're reading mystery, is deeply embedded in a setting. It comes out of the setting, the environment, the climate, the opportunities, the lack of opportunities, people's culture, the crimes themselves often come out of what the environment is like. And I don't see that happening in a lot of other types of books, you know, that I love reading. You know, I love reading women's fiction, but a lot of women's fiction is sort of like, well, it's a suburb, maybe somewhere, it's a small town somewhere. I'm really getting into reading the new like domestic thrillers, you know, which are always seem to be set in somebody's suburb, you know. It's like big house and mysterious doings on behind the doors. But there's no really sense of, it could be anywhere. It could be a suburb outside of Cleveland or outside of Boston. But for so many mystery writers, we're so staked down to the locations we write in. You can't separate the characters of the crimes or what happens from that location. And I think it's one of the great things about this genre.
Yeah, absolutely. Paula, what about you?
Well, I totally agree with Julia that one of the reasons I love writing crime fiction is because, and reading it is because its setting permeates most of these books and most of these stories. And I love that. I love setting. I mean, when I first started to write this series, I set it in Vermont because that was my happy place. I was living on the South Shore, you know, in a very populated or thickly settled, as we say in New England, section of the South Shore. And I just like to go to Vermont to the woods. And so I just set it there for fun, and not knowing that within a couple of years, I would be moving 40 miles from Vermont, almost there, to New Hampshire and have my own little piece of woods. So we have 19 acres of woods here, and a little lake and a marshland and a beaver pond and a barn and all the stuff that I, you know, wrote about in the books. It sort of came true for me in this the coolest way ever. And I spend, you know, a lot of time in the woods with the dogs. And that's how most of my stories open, in the woods with the dogs, Mercy Carr and Elvis. And so for me, the setting is real. And I sort of, you know, created it in my own life because it was my happy place. And I think that, you know, you're either a woods person or you're not. You're either cut out for New England or you're not. I wanted to write about, you know, a military policewoman. So she was going to be sturdy and self-reliant, right? And that's what New Englanders are. They're sturdy and self-reliant. And they are ready to take on the forces of nature, you know, places where there's no cell phone service and, you know, there's you're on your own in a blizzard, all those kinds of things I really find fascinating. And I find the history of New England fascinating, with generations of people who came here and survived what are really tough conditions. And that makes for good fiction.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I was thinking about why that is, that sort of police procedurals or books that center on law enforcement professionals often are so locally focused. And I wonder if it's because you have to know a place in order to dig into people's secrets and find the skeletons in their closets, and to even know where to look for skeletons in closets. You have to really know that place. And it's kind of, you know, it's a little bit of a trope, but it's very effective. The thing of like an outsider detective coming into a small town and completely missing it because they don't understand, you know, where people really are and what really motivates them. So that's very interesting.
So do we need to ask you a question about settings, since you switched settings from New England to Ireland?
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
I'm asking you.
Yeah. Oh, so how do I approach setting? Well, very briefly, I mean, I think New England and Ireland were both places that I had come to know pretty well through living there. And I think for me, that was really key, that on some level, I was an outsider in both places, but spent time and, I've lived in New England much longer now than I lived in Ireland, but I think it was, as Archer said, it's bringing that sort of ignorance and curiosity to experiencing a place and just wanting to know more about it. And then on some level, kind of becoming a part of the fabric of it. So yeah, I think it's, for me, having spent some time in the place is really, really important. I think I'd find it hard to write about a place I'd never been and just research online or something. I think that would be tough, but thank you, Paul. So we are getting within 10 minutes of the 6 o'clock hour. And we had one more process question that I thought was a good one to jump in with here. But please, if you have other questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll make sure to ask them. The question we got it's a great one. I remember struggling with this. It was, what do you do if you keep rewriting the first 10,000 words of your novel over and over and over again, and you can't actually finish it? That was me. That was the first 10 years, I think, of me trying to write a novel. And so I'm very sympathetic, and I'm curious, I can offer my experience at the end, but I'm curious how you all have solved that problem, or would suggest our questioner solve that problem.
You throw it out, because it's a learning process. You learn through your mistakes. If you're rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, it's just my personal opinion, obviously, but been there, done that. I have a filing cabinet filled with the most unreadable tripe, which I call exercises in typing. And they are beginning of novel after beginning of novel after beginning of novel. And I don't simply, sacrifice them to the flames, because they're my training wheels. They are how I learned to stumble before I learned to walk. And those are invaluable, only a sentiment at this point. You don't actually go back to that trash and go, oh, there must be a great book there somewhere. No, there's not. But it is part of the process. If you obsess, however, on the fact that this first novel, this is it, and you just rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, I think you better become a carpenter. Get out of the business. This is hard work. It's lonely work. It's disciplined work. It's exhausting work. It's demanding work. And if you're just going to end up doing that, then you might want to look in the mirror and say, I know, watercolors or whatever.
Good. Julia, what about you?
It's hard to spend 10 years redoing your watercolors, aren't it? I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with Archer. If you've spent 10 years working on something, throw it out, because it's not stimulating enough. When you've got an idea that is big enough for a whole novel, you know it, because there's a certain gravity to it. And as you start, Archer and I are very organic writers. It's like we write to figure out what's going on, and Paula is more organized and stuff. But whichever way you do it, if you've got a really compelling, a good enough idea, it'll keep leading you on. You'll know there are going to be those scenes, and the chapters keep coming as you work on it. If you're doing 10,000 words over and over and over again, that's not. Also, I would say I would hand out the wisdom of Robert Heinlein, one of the grandmasters of American science fiction, who had his rules for writing were: write it, do one edit, send it out, do not edit more until you have, it's been purchased, and then write something else. And I think a lot of people think that this is it, I've started my book and I'm going to write a book for a finish. And a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't get to the finish. A lot of people write one book and it never goes anywhere because it's terrible. I've had friends who wrote, 5 whole novels before they actually ever sold one. Because it's kind of like parenting. It's like the only way to learn it is by doing it. Not that, that's a bad analogy, because that means our kids are terrible. We should put them in course.
5 novels.
Out.
All right, forget I said that. I would edit that out and go back and rewrite it.
So how many kids did you used to have?
Paula, what about you?
Well, it's interesting, because I think, like a lot of people, I have a bunch of unfinished novels. But I think part of that is because, like Julia said, the idea wasn't big enough and I couldn't entertain myself. If I can't entertain myself, there's no way I can entertain you. If I get bored and quit, then I know the idea wasn't good enough. When I get an idea I can really latch on to, then I go full forward. If I get stuck, then I just do research. I started off as a reporter, and a lot of times I'm stuck because I don't know what comes next. And sometimes if you're redoing the first 10,000 words because you don't know what comes next, you know, or you've like beat it to death and you need a new idea. But if you don't need a new idea and you're convinced that the idea can sustain 300 pages, then ask yourself, you know, just research, just lose yourself in the research. And that always saves me. Whenever I think I'm stuck and halfway through a book and think, oh my, you know, I can't write my way out of this, I do research and I find a way.
So I'll tell you my story about that, because this was a huge problem for me when I started writing. I had the first sort of 100 pages of what ended up being my first mystery novel, and I had worked those 100 pages to death. You know, I had edited them over and over and over, and I somehow, Paula, you'll appreciate this, I somehow got the idea that I could start approaching literary agents, which if you don't know, don't do that. If you only have 100 pages of a novel, don't approach a literary agent. You're not ready. But I somehow got this idea, and I sent off query letters, and I guess I wasn't clear in my query letter that I had only written 100 pages of the novel, because a very famous literary agent got back to me, liked the idea, and said, I would like you to send me your full manuscript, and this but was like a gift from the universe. I to this day, I don't know who loves me up there and sent me this gift from the universe. She said, but I am having surgery and I will not be able to read your entire manuscript for 3 months. So would you please send it to me on August 1st or whatever it was. So I sort of read this letter and said, holy, I have to finish this book in 3 months. But it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because, you know, I'd been stuck and I sprinted, I got the book done. Of course, the literary agent didn't take it on because it was terrible, because I'd written it in 3 months. But I had a draft, and then I could revise and edit, and I eventually, you know, found an agent and published that book. So if you have a friend, this is my advice, if you have a friend who could pretend to be a literary agent who is having surgery and can't read your book for 3 months, that may be the thing to shake you out of your paralysis with this book. So we're just about at 6 o'clock. That's pretty good. Does anybody have any questions they want to put into the Q&A? Do any of you have questions you want to ask each other to sort of finish this off here?
Oh, I see a question in the Q&A for me. So Nancy DeCourcy, why did I it's Clare, return her Louise Penny book without having finished it in the library? My character is a new mother, and she returns. Sometimes I like to stick the names of books that I like in and have my characters reading them. And she returns a Louise Penny book. She hasn't had a chance to finish it. Nancy, that was based on my own life as a new mother. I went through 1 year where the only thing I ever read were short stories in the bathroom with the door locked. So, and I actually had a period of time when I would take out a novel. I'd go to the library and I'd get a bunch of kids' books, and I'd take out a novel, and then I'd come back with a stack of kids' books, and I'd never been able to finish the novel because I was just overwhelmed. I was face down in parenting. So, based on a real life incident that happened to me.
That's great. And we have some comments over. Oh, Paula, I love that your story is inspired by a true incident, somebody says. And we have some praise for Archer, that he's also someone who's written is also a pantser, and she also grew up as an Army brat and also wanted to be in the military. So we have a lot of connections in the Q&A here. That's great. Well, Sandy, should I turn it back over to you?
Oh, no, you're fine. I just was checking in, and you have more questions, I think. Do you want to answer a few more? Do you want to, the people want to hang out? What's the consensus?
Yes, we do. We do have a couple more. Oh, this is a good one for Archer. Will Armand Gamache ever get to work with Joe?
Well, it's not up to either Joe or Armand. It's the puppet masters, so that's a different kind of question. And this is probably reflective of the aforementioned hardcore Yankee speaking to you. I'm not inclined to play that much with others. As you may have discovered, this process is intensely personal to me. It's what I do for my profession. So while I find it captivating, it's not fun. And it's not something I particularly share. So I would say, Heartbreak City to one side, no. Not inclined to cohabitate these two detectives.
What about you, Julia and Paula? Have you ever considered that, or have you, in the comic book industry, they call them crossovers, right? Yeah,
I mean, it's hard not to, sometimes. I mean, I've actually thought, I've got, Russ Van Alstyne, 50 something, it was living about 20 minutes away from Rutland, Vermont. And I thought, he should probably know Joe. They probably go to some sort of regional conferences and they've met together, but yeah, it's I don't know how people who write together do it, because it just strikes me as being really, really challenging. On the other hand, I can always use the boost. So if Louise Penny wants to appear with their characters in my books, what the heck?
You and me both.
I remember a series of books that was written by two sisters, and I can't remember what the series is. You probably know what it is.
PJ Parrish.
Yeah.
PJ Parrish.
And one of them lives in Hawaii, and one lives in California or Florida or someplace. They don't even live in the same state.
Well, that's what Ellery Queen was. They were two cousins.
Really?
Yeah. Ellery Queen didn't exist. Ellery Queen was these two. One guy did the plots, the other guy did the writing. Match made in heaven.
Yeah.
Wow.
that would be nice, wouldn't it, if someone just fed you plots. And
I know. I see there's an arrangement I could probably get behind.
Paula, what about you in your work as someone who works with writers, an editor, and an agent? I'm sure there's more collaboration than there is for the rest of us.
Well, sure. I mean, I was an acquisitions editor for many years and helped a lot of writers. And then I was, as an agent, I've helped a lot of writers, get their work published so that it's worthy of publication. But it didn't necessarily, all that didn't necessarily help me doing my own work. That said, I know a lot of writing teams, including at careerauthors.com, Brian Andrews and Jeff Wilson, who are a team who write the Tier 1 military thriller series, and they work really well together, and they sort of go back and forth, and I find it a fascinating idea. I don't know how it would actually work, but like Julia and Archer said, if either one of them wanted to pair up, I'd be like, hey, or you too, Sarah. I'd be on board. I'd give it a try. But it is interesting the different ways that writing teams work.
Yeah,
it's a different